the via media between Calvinism and Arminianism. There has been a division of evangelicalism between those who hold to the doctrines of John Calvin and those who hold to the doctrine of James Arminius. This conflict has been going on long before those two gentlemen. The conflict began in the late 5th century with the writings of Aurelius Augustine and Pelagius, a British monk. When Pelagius arrived at Rome and he saw the licentiousness of the Roman clergy, he said that people needed to take responsibility for their conduct. He declared that only those who are righteous will be saved and that a terrible fate awaited all of us unless we repented. But the lascivious priests of Rome, rather than repenting, excused their conduct by arguing that all men are fallen in Adam, and therefore no one should judge another of sin. But Pelagius responded by denying the effects of the fall and asserting man's ability and therefore his responsibility to live a sinless life. Now this led Augustine to reproach his teachings as they went against the doctrines of original sin and predestination, and thus ensued the division within evangelical theology between those who defend the sovereignty of God and predestination on the one hand, and those who deny predestination and defend the love of God and the freedom of the will and human responsibility on the other. And so we have the age-long dispute between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Now, jumping ahead to the 16th century, we find the Augustinian monk Martin Luther asserting divine sovereignty and the bondage of the will against Erasmus of Rotterdam, and the same thoroughgoing Augustinianism being taught by Calvin in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, those who followed Calvin's doctrine soon began to call themselves Calvinists. The establishment of Calvinism resulted in a reaction by James Arminius, who rejected the idea that God would choose to save some and deny others solely based upon an arbitrary, unconditional assertion of his will. Arminius felt that Augustine's doctrine insulted the benevolent character of God and denied human responsibility for sin and really made God out to be the author of sin. His followers were called the Remonstrants, and in their arguments against Calvinism, they utilized Pelagius' rejection of the effects of the fall and his insistence that a good God would not make men evil. Therefore, they said, number one, man is free and therefore responsible to choose good or evil. Number two, God only chooses those whom he knew in advance would first choose him. Number three, the atonement of Christ was a loving atonement for all men, but it was limited in its efficacy to those who come to him freely and responsibly in faith. Number four, God's calling is resistible, and thus man is responsible for rejecting the call. And then lastly, point 5, those who answer the call could later fall away and be lost once again. The responsibility to remain in the faith is man's. Now, to answer these assertions, the Calvinists convened a synod in 1619 called the Synod of Dort. And from that assembly, the following 5 points were set forth in answer to the 5 points of the Arminian remonstrance. For pedagogical purposes, the acrostic word tulip was used to help students remember the 5 points of Calvinism. And these 5 points are T for total depravity. Man is not free to choose good, but is totally depraved and unable to come to God on his own. U for unconditional election. Divine election isn't based on foreknowledge, but on the sovereign will of God. L for limited atonement. The atonement is limited to the elect alone and not to all mankind. I for irresistible grace. No one can resist the effectual calling of God. P for perseverance of the faith. No one chosen is ever lost, but they will persevere to the end. And so here we have the two camps of Calvinism and the Remonstrants or Arminians firmly entrenched against each other. But underlying this heated debate is a doctrinal difficulty, which is really the root of the entire debate, although it is not overtly stated or clearly disclosed. Now, that difficulty is commonly called the problem of evil. Now, what is this problem of evil? It consists of the following syllogism.
Number 1, if God is perfectly good, he would want to save all men. Number 2, if God is all-powerful, he could save all men. Number 3, some men are not saved. Therefore, conclusion, God is either not perfectly good or not all-powerful. Now, the way theologians try to resolve this dilemma determines whether they fall into the Augustinian Calvinist camp or the Pelagian Arminian camp. But is there a via media between the two camps? A way of resolving this? Let's take a look at the problem again. Number 1, if God is perfectly good, he would want to save all men. Number 2, if God is all-powerful, he could save all men. And number 3, some men are not saved. There is only one of these points that both sides agree on, and that is some men are not saved. But what if that's the problem? What if in the final analysis, the last point is not biblical? We would then have the following correct syllogism. Number 1, God is perfectly good and wants to save all men. Number 2, God is all-powerful and can save all men. Number 3, all men will be saved. Conclusion, therefore God is perfectly good and all-powerful. Now we have a cogent syllogism. So we see that the resolution to the problem of evil, our theodicy, is to get rid of the impossible notion that some men will never be saved. But does that agree with the Bible? Yes, it does. Because the only passage that seems to teach the doctrine of endless torment is found in the Olivet Discourse. And that passage in the parable of the sheep and the goats does not actually teach endless torment. But all other verses, as well as that one, used to teach the doctrine of endless torment or annihilation can better be explained as agreeing with universal restoration, the idea that all men will be saved. Secondly, since divine sovereignty and divine benevolence are in the Bible, endless torment cannot be by process of elimination. And 3, only universalism presents a viable theodicy like the one that we presented above. Universalism, therefore, is the via media that we've been seeking all along. What a comforting message. As Jeremiah the prophet once wrote, "No one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." Lamentations chapter 3, verses 31 through 33.